Welcome to Dialogue. This conversation is part of a series on the analysis of the COVID era, and it focuses on how collective behavior during COVID, well, it mirrored historical moments when constitutional rights were curtailed, narratives were tightly enforced, and the public was shaped socially and psychologically to conform to a predetermined agenda. We are launching into a deep dive that I think requires us to look past our immediate political discomfort and really examine the recurring patterns of human behavior under intense stress.
It's a heavy topic.
It is. But it's absolutely essential if we want to navigate future crises with our freedoms intact. We have to start with this challenging, maybe even humbling idea that you see across centuries, every generation. Every single one genuinely believes it would never fall for it.
Oh, we're different. We're smarter.
Exactly. That they'd see right through the propaganda, that they would resist injustice, that they would never, ever trade liberty for safety. They truly believe they're the exception.
And history, in its, brutal, dispassionate honesty, always disagrees. And I think it's crucial for our mission today. We are explicitly focused on the mechanism. We're not focused on the crisis itself.
This isn't about relitigating public health debates.
Not at all. We are studying what happens to the social and legal fabric of a society when it perceives itself to be under an existential threat, an invisible threat often.
Stress test.
A profound, high-stakes stress test. It tests your constitution. It tests the limits of free speech, the integrity of conscience. And what these moments reveal time and time again is a surprisingly consistent pattern of systemic failure and widespread psychological capitulation.
And that framework leads us right to the core thesis of this whole conversation, which really overturns a comforting fiction we've all been taught.
The bad guy narrative.
The bad guy narrative. We assume that for extraordinary harm to happen, massive injustice, the dismantling of civil liberties, it must require some kind of extraordinary, almost Hollywood-level evil.
A villain in a smoky room pulling the levers.
We're looking for that person.
And that narrative, while it's simple and it's satisfying, it really only protects our own self-image. The reality is far more subtle and, frankly, far more terrifying.
Which is?
Extraordinary harm rarely requires extraordinary evil. It doesn't need malice at the top. It only requires ordinary people. Ordinary people conforming inside systems that have temporarily gone broken.
Systems where all the incentives just line up perfectly.
Perfectly. Fear, social approval, career safety, they all align. So we're focusing on the architecture of that conformity, on the predictable human and institutional mechanisms, and much less on assigning personal malice to the millions of people who are, just following directions.
Okay, so let's unpack that. If your goal is to curtail foundational liberties in a functioning democracy, you can't just stand up and declare, hey, everyone, we're canceling the Bill of Rights.
No, that would be too jarring, a little too on the nose.
Right. So the process has to begin with what we're calling the unprecedented trap.
It's the foundational first step. It is the golden key that unlocks the curtailment of liberties across every single historical example we've looked at.
And the claim is always the same.
Always. Whether you're dealing with a foreign enemy, a virus, an ideological threat, it starts with, this situation is unprecedented, or we have genuinely never faced anything like this before.
And the logical conclusion from that is?
Therefore, normal rules don't apply. By claiming exceptionalism for this specific moment, the people in authority grant themselves the moral and the legal license to just temporarily suspend established norms and laws.
And to the average person, it feels necessary in that moment. That feeling of existential dread is exactly what strips away all the boring, tedious, but necessary legal restraints.
Exactly.
What's amazing, or maybe horrifying, is just how loud the historical echoes are when you start stacking them up. The threat changes, but the justification is identical.
It really is. Look back at the pattern. World War I, the U.S. government uses the threat to national security to bring in the Espionage and Sedition Acts,
which basically criminalized dissent.
It effectively suspended free speech. It wasn't abolished, it was just redefined as obstructing the war effort.
And the escalation happens so fast. During World War II, you have the necessity of wartime security leading to the executive order for Japanese internment camps.
And that wasn't a slow legal process. It was immediate. A blanket suspension of due process based on nothing more than group identity and fear.
No trials, no evidence, just fear.
Then you get the Cold War. The crisis is ideological communism. But the weapon at home is McCarthyism.
Using the state and the media to just destroy lives based on suspicion.
Mere suspicion of what you might believe.
And then, in our lifetimes, post 9/11, The fear of terrorism was used to justify this massive, secretive expansion of state power. Mass surveillance, the Patriot Act.
Indefinite detentions. And of course, during the recent COVID era, we saw restrictions on movement, on assembly, and critically, on expression and information sharing. The pattern is it's undeniable when you see it laid out.
The details of the crisis change.
The justification, the appeal to unprecedented necessity, it doesn't. It's always framed as temporary, painful, but ultimately necessary to save society from collapse.
And this brings us to the actual mechanism of how they do it. As you said, rights are almost never abolished outright.
No, that would cause too much of a fight.
Instead, they're quietly reinterpreted. It's a kind of linguistic maneuvering, a semantic shift that happens right out in the open.
And the state of emergency creates the perfect cover. It creates urgency. And we have to remember, urgency is the enemy of due process. It's the enemy of nuance.
Urgency favors authority.
Always. Because authority offers speed and it offers clarity, even if it's a false clarity.
So these linguistic shifts, they're not accidental, they're functional. They're designed to morally disarm everybody.
That's the key. They disarm the population and the enforcers. And we saw very specific, concrete examples of how these fundamental concepts got twisted.
Okay, let's take free speech. It didn't stop being protected by law, not officially. But in the public square, it very quickly got relabeled as inherently dangerous or misinformation.
Right. If it questioned the official response, whether it was policy or, the science, it was immediately framed not as a disagreement, but as a danger to public health.
And what about dissent? I mean, dissent is literally the engine of science. It's how democracy works.
Dissent got reframed as harmful or antisocial. This shift, it pathologizes the very act of asking questions, makes it seem like a sickness.
And then there's personal autonomy, the right to make decisions about your own body, your own health. That was reframed too. Liberty wasn't seen as a foundational right anymore.
No, it was labeled as selfish. Inherently selfish, because your individual choice was positioned as a direct threat to the safety of the collective. The social pressure was just immense.
And on the state level, what about due process? The slow, careful application of law that's designed to protect us from the state.
That just became inconvenient. It was too slow for emergency. You saw mandates and policies issued by executive fiat through public health departments, emergency declarations,
Bypassing all the normal debate.
bypassing legislatures, public hearings, immediate judicial review. The system prioritized speed and uniformity over legal thoroughness. It treated the necessary friction of democracy like it was just, annoying bureaucracy.
That is a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
That the language itself protects the conscience of the system.
It does. The language change, so the conscience of the bureaucrat or your neighbor doesn't have to feel any guilt. They're not infringing on rights. They're just upholding the new, redefined moral imperative of safety.
Okay, so that's the legal framework. Now we have to move into the driver's seat of this whole process. The one thing that accelerates obedience faster than any law ever could.
Fear.
Fear, the master variable.
It's the turbocharger for obedience and conformity. And it's so important to understand what fear actually does to the human brain.
It's not just people get scared and do dumb things.
No, that's way too simple. Fear doesn't make people stupid. It makes them urgent. And that urgency is what fundamentally changes how you think. It shifts the brain from complex, critical analysis to simple, immediate reaction.
Which, to be fair, can sometimes look a lot like stupid.
It can, but it's a specific biological process. And behavioral science gives us a really predictable model for this. There are 3 specific, measurable impacts that this urgency has on a society's ability to think for itself.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, fear dramatically narrows your perception. When your brain is in a state of high alarm, it literally stops processing complexity. It stops seeing nuance or multiple possible solutions.
It's a survival mechanism.
It's pure survival. You fixate on the immediate threat and the simplest, most direct path to safety. And that path is almost always the one being screamed at you by the highest perceived authority. You lose the ability to compare different viewpoints.
Okay, what's the second effect?
It severely shortens moral reasoning. You stop thinking about long-term ethical implications.
Like the slippery slope of giving up rights.
Or the consequences for minority groups or the economic destruction of lockdowns. All that goes away. Your focus shrinks to the immediate calculation. What do I have to do right now, as instructed, to survive this hour and protect my family? The long view just vanishes.
And the third effect.
And this is maybe the most critical one for the system we're analyzing. Fear dramatically increases our reliance on authority figures.
We look for a savior.
We actively seek out and submit to strong, decisive leadership that offers simple answers and clear protective rules. When a society feels powerless against an invisible threat, a virus, a terrorist, it will trade freedom for the feeling of safety in a heartbeat.
So the result of all this urgency is an environment that is just perfectly primed for what?
It reliably favors simple black and white narratives, clear villains to blame, strong, centralized authority, and mandatory social conformity. It's the perfect environment for accelerating the adoption of any predetermined agenda, whatever its origin.
And once that simple, urgent story is locked in, the system has to move to the next phase, narrative enforcement.
Immediately. Because if you have the perfect, necessary prescription for safety, you absolutely cannot afford to let debate or dissent or genuine scientific inquiry slow down compliance.
And the goal of that enforcement, this is critical, it isn't objective truth.
No. In a crisis, the institutional goal is societal coordination. It's about mobilizing millions of people in lockstep. And to do that, you need uniform, non-contradictory messaging.
And you have to eliminate conflicting information.
You have to eliminate it fast. Whether that information is proven false or just inconveniently true, it doesn't matter. It has to go.
So the tools of coordination kick in, the first one being repetition.
Repetition replaces debate. If you hear the same simple phrase, the same slogan, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, over and over across every platform, social media, news, government briefings, you just internalize it as fact.
It's the mere exposure effect, not critical inquiry.
Exactly. And then you have the use of experts. Experts, who should be all about inquiry and robust debate, are transformed into symbols of singular authority.
Their job isn't to ask questions anymore.
Their job is to confirm and reinforce the one coordinated message. And any expert who fails to do that, who raises a question or points to conflicting data, is immediately categorized.
They're not just disagreeing.
They are labeled as deviants, as something socially and morally wrong.
And this whole effort, it needs the silence of dissent, the uniform messaging, but it works best because of that third piece.
Social enforcement.
We police ourselves.
The state has limited resources. Society polices itself far more efficiently, and that's where the incredible speed of modern compliance really comes from.
Which brings us right to the COVID era as a case study. I mean, from a sociological standpoint, it was incredibly efficient at achieving compliance without formally repealing a single law.
It was. It demonstrated a modern, highly decentralized form of control, which makes it very difficult to pin down.
The genius of it, in a really chilling way, was in the mechanisms used to control speech. We didn't see the state passing formal censorship laws. That's old school.
Very old school. Instead, the control was applied through softer distributed pressures that carried massive economic and social consequences.
Let's start with algorithmic suppression.
This means dissenting views or inconvenient data were just made invisible. They weren't necessarily banned outright. They were just demonetized, deboosted, shadow banned on the big platforms and search engines.
So you were free to speak.
But no one could hear you. It's an incredibly subtle and devastating form of censorship.
And then there was the platform pressure, not just from algorithms, but from other places.
Oh, absolutely. Enormous pressure on the tech companies, sometimes from government agencies, sometimes just from public opinion, to enforce the official narrative. But the real risk wasn't just losing your Twitter account. It was professional retaliation.
This is huge.
It's everything. Questioning the narrative meant immediate, significant career risk. You could lose your funding, your research grants, you could be excluded from professional circles.
So the people who knew the most, the doctors, the virologists, were often the first to be silenced.
Because they had the most to lose professionally. The chilling effect was profound.
And then the glue that holds it all together, social ostracization.
The fear of being canceled. If you stepped outside the narrow lines of conformity, you risked being shamed, judged, excluded by friends, family, colleagues. That constant threat is exponentially more powerful than any law.
Because we're wired for belonging.
We are. And as you said, the key insight is just chilling. Censorship works best when no one calls it censorship.
Right. It's just rebranded, community standards, public health guidelines.
Stopping misinformation. It all sounds so reasonable.
And as this narrative got stronger and compliance became everything, we saw these new, really intense moral hierarchies form. New social classes based on nothing but your adherence to the rules.
It happened so fast. Society stopped seeing individuals and just saw moral categories. which of course makes enforcement much easier.
The division was so stark, you had the responsible, the people who followed every rule, who wore the masks in their cars alone.
And who enthusiastically enforce those rules on others, often through public shaming.
And then you had the irresponsible, the ones who questioned things, who dissented, who just chose a different path for their own health.
And even more powerful than that was the institutional division, the labeling of jobs as essential versus non-essential.
Which wasn't just a practical label.
No, it was a moral statement. It effectively decided whose job, whose business, whose entire livelihood was worthy of protection, and whose was expendable for the greater good.
The essential worker was a hero. The small business owner who was forced to close was just a necessary sacrifice.
So what's the consequence of that? Of merging moral identity with policy compliance?
It creates the space for cruelty.
It creates the necessary psychological distance for cruelty to flourish. The actions taken against the irresponsible, the shaming, the exclusion, firing people from their jobs, it no longer felt cruel to the enforcers.
It felt like justice.
It felt like a moral, even heroic duty. You were protecting the collective from the selfish few.
And this brings us back to the speed and the terrifying efficiency of social enforcement. The state didn't need a secret police force.
No. We became the secret police for each other.
The examples were everywhere. People shaming neighbors for having a barbecue.
Reporting small businesses to the authorities for being open. And most disturbingly, you saw this widespread public celebration when dissenters were punished.
People mocking those who lost their jobs or got arrested, viewing them not as victims of overreach, but as deviants who got what they deserved.
It's a profound sociological truth. Compliance becomes a moral identity. People adopt the identity of the good, virtuous citizen. Yeah. And the most efficient enforcement system in the world is simply the primal human need for social approval.
And if the price of following your own conscience is being exiled and shamed?
Most people, historically, will choose belonging. Every time.
Okay, so now we have to shift into the historical analysis, and we need to repeat the disclaimer here. This is really important.
It is. We are absolutely not comparing the scale or the intent of these historical events to each other or to the present day. We are strictly comparing the mechanism.
How the levers of control and conformity work when a system is under extreme stress.
We're looking for the shared functional blueprints, not suggesting any kind of moral equivalence. It's a crucial distinction.
So let's start with maybe the most intellectually challenging one, Nazi Germany. When we look back, we assume the whole system was just populated by monsters.
It's how we protect ourselves. It's how we sleep at night. Those were bad people. We are good people.
But the historical consensus, driven by thinkers like Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil, paints a very different picture.
It does. It suggests that most participants, the mid-level bureaucrats, the transport officials, the local police, the ordinary citizens who just went along, were, by all appearances, ordinary people. They genuinely believed they were being moral or patriotic, or simply doing their job within a necessary framework set by the state.
So the system didn't require everyone to be a hateful ideologue.
No. At a functional level, it didn't require widespread, virulent hatred. It required compliance, professional detachment, and procedural adherence.
So what was the core mechanism that allowed for that level of cruelty?
The primary mechanism was bureaucracy. It's a genius tool for diluting individual responsibility.
How so?
When a horrific policy is implemented through a series of small, impersonal administrative tasks, you fill out a form, you sign a document, you log a delivery, the individual bureaucrat feels responsible only for their tiny, manageable task.
Not for the monstrous final outcome.
Exactly. It's moral outsourcing. The system allows for dehumanization through abstraction. You're not hurting your neighbor. You're processing a unit, following a directive. And in that environment, silence is a critical form of participation. It signals agreement and keeps the machine running smoothly.
Silence as participation. That's a key idea. It means you don't have to actively support the agenda.
You just have to prioritize your own comfort, your own career, over intervening for someone else.
Okay, next example. The Japanese internment during World War II. A much more direct case of constitutional suspension based on fear.
Right. In this case, there was no pretense of individual justice. There were no trials, no evidence of disloyalty needed.
Rights were just suspended wholesale, based entirely on your ethnicity and the threat you might pose.
Regardless of whether you were an American citizen, regardless of your demonstrable loyalty, the mechanism was the complete removal of due process for a whole group, justified by the urgent need for wartime security.
It showed that in the grip of a crisis, the government can just decide an entire demographic loses its rights based on preemptive fear.
And yes, that violation was later apologized for, which is important.
Mm.
But the apology didn't restore the dignity or the lost businesses or the stolen years of freedom. The mechanism of group guilt and preventative punishment had already done its work.
All right, let's shift to the Cold War. McCarthyism. The crisis was ideological, but the mechanism of control was almost purely social.
Intensely social. In that era, your speech, or even just who you associated with, was essentially criminalized,
Mm.
not by a formal law for the most part, but socially, through blacklisting, professional shaming, ostracization.
And the central mechanism was what?
The conflation of accusation with absolute guilt. The moment you were publicly accused of being a communist sympathizer, your career was over. The truth didn't matter.
It completely shifted the burden of proof.
Entirely. You were required to prove a negative that you are not something, which is impossible. So silence became the ultimate survival strategy.
Because if you spoke out, if you defended a friend,
You risked being labeled yourself. The power of the label was everything. The fear of being labeled became far more powerful than truth, because the truth couldn't get your job back once the label was stuck on you. And this mechanism, destroying dissent through reputation, it's highly relevant to the decentralized controls we see today.
And finally, let's look at the post-9/11 surveillance state, a modern study in that permanent trade-off between rights and security.
The passage of the Patriot Act, the mass data collection, it illustrates exactly how a perceived existential threat is used to get people to trade away their privacy.
It was a classic fear-based transaction.
It was, give us your data, your privacy, your anonymity, and we will keep you safe from the invisible enemy.
And the mechanism there is this creeping expansion of state power, always disguised as a temporary measure.
Always. We were sure these were temporary surgical intrusions needed for our immediate safety, but the cycle is always the same. Temporary measures never feel temporary in hindsight. Once you build the technological and bureaucratic infrastructure for mass surveillance, it doesn't get dismantled when the crisis ends.
It just becomes a permanent tool.
It gets filed away, ready to be deployed for the next crisis, whatever that might be.
So this whole look at mechanisms brings us back to the core challenge, which is avoiding that most tempting trap in social analysis.
The myth of bad people.
It's so comforting because it keeps it at a distance. We think, oh, those people back then were uniquely flawed, or I'm smarter than them, or they just had bad leaders. It protects our self-image. It lets us believe we're immune.
But the reality is that under similar systemic incentives, most ordinary people behave in very similar ways. Focusing on individual evil distracts us from the real problem.
Which is institutional failure. The moment our institutions start prioritizing their own survival and coordination over their founding principles, truth, liberty, inquiry.
That's the institutional anarchy we're talking about.
So what are the key institutional failure points? The things that allow ordinary, decent people to become gears in this machine.
First and foremost, accountability disappears. During an emergency, when rules are suspended, the normal checks and balances, judicial review, legislative oversight, they just vanish. It creates a vacuum where no one can be held responsible for the mistakes or the damage.
And second, the incentives all flip.
Exactly. Incentives actively reward compliance. If you want to keep your job, get a promotion, get your research funded, you have to publicly comply with the narrative, even if you have private doubts.
And conversely, dissent carries immediate and visible penalties.
Career-ending penalties. If you speak out, you risk being defunded, deplatformed, socially isolated. The institution doesn't even need to believe you're wrong. It just needs to believe you're disruptive to the coordinated message.
And we have to remember, institutional failure doesn't always look like chaos. It's not riots in the streets.
Sometimes it looks bureaucratic. It looks like a long chain of rubber-stamped documents, signed mandates, and impersonal directives, all handled by people just, diligently following protocol. It's the absence of ethical friction.
Okay, so building on that, let's dive deeper into the primal psychological choice the individual faces when a crisis hits.
This is where we confront the core human fear that overrides almost everything else, the psychology of belonging.
We are profoundly social creatures.
We are hardwired to fear exile, shame, and isolation. Evolutionarily, being cast out of the tribe was a death sentence. These fears are existential. They are far more powerful than the abstract intellectual fear of, say, constitutional loss.
So when people are faced with that choice, conformity or integrity, what's really going through their heads, it's not as simple as choosing lies over truth.
No, it's never framed that way in the moment. The choice is framed as, do I keep my identity, my job, and the psychological warmth of belonging, or do I risk becoming a pariah, ridiculed, exiled, and maybe fired?
And under that kind of pressure.
Most people didn't choose lies over truth. They chose belonging over exile. They chose the perceived safety of the group, even if it meant performing belief in something they had deep private doubts about.
And that choice leads directly to something we saw a lot of: the failure of critical thought, even among highly educated people. You call this intelligence as costume.
Yes, because during a crisis, complex ideas get compressed. Simple slogans replace genuine understanding. People stop seeking nuance and start seeking simple, absolute certainty.
And certainty becomes the highest virtue.
Because it signals confidence, it signals moral goodness, and most importantly, it signals compliance.
And that's the real danger. When compliance is suddenly the highest social and intellectual virtue, then just confidently repeating the right message gets confused with being intelligent.
That's it, exactly. If you could confidently repeat the slogans, rigidly adhere to the protocols, and shame anyone who didn't, you were seen as smart, rational, and virtuous.
Even if you hadn't done a single moment of critical thinking about the policy itself.
Your intellectual performance, your ability to adopt the right language quickly, became a substitute for moral goodness. Your ability to think critically was sacrificed for the ability to signal belonging.
This analysis of institutional and psychological failure brings us to the final and maybe the most dangerous state a society can find itself in after a crisis: the absence of reckoning.
What happens when the fear subsides and the immediate danger passes? What happens to the architects and the enforcers of all the excess?
And in almost every historical pattern we've looked at, the answer is not much.
Not much at all. There are usually no systemic trials. There are no mass firings of leaders who were demonstrably wrong or who oversaw massive infringements on rights. There are rarely, if ever, sincere, detailed apologies that address the scale of the harm done.
And why is that lack of consequence so devastating for the future? Why is that silence so dangerous?
Because when no one pays a price for harmful behavior done in an emergency, that behavior isn't just forgotten, it's reinforced. It's normalized into the institutional playbook.
The system learns a lesson.
The implicit, powerful lesson is, when the next crisis hits, you can use the exact same mechanisms of overreach, suppression, and suspension of rights, and there will be no professional, legal, or social consequence for those in charge. The infrastructure is proven to work, and the psychological cost to the powerful is zero.
So we circle all the way back to the central warning. We have to stop thinking that history repeats events.
It never does. It never replicates the exact circumstances of a past war or a specific pandemic. History repeats the conditions under which those events occurred.
And those conditions are, as we've laid out, incredibly predictable.
They are the alignment of four things: intense fear, centralized authority, absolute moral certainty, the belief that we are right, and, crucially, silenced dissent.
And whenever those four things line up,
The patterns we've discussed, the redefinition of rights, the acceleration of obedience, the self-policing social enforcement, they will reemerge with devastating efficiency.
which means the next crisis, whenever it comes, it won't necessarily look like a biological pandemic.
No, it won't need to. It could be a foreign war, a climate emergency, a massive cyber attack, a technological disruption, anything that demands centralized control and rapid social coordination.
But the infrastructure is already built.
The psychological and institutional infrastructure for rapid, compulsory social coordination is already built, it's been tested, and it's been normalized. The platforms have their mechanisms for algorithmic suppression, professionals know the severe cost of dissent, and society has learned just how powerful social shaming is as an enforcement tool.
The blueprint is just filed away.
Waiting for the next wave of intense, pervasive, fear-driven urgency.
So the final synthesis here is that the most dangerous belief we can hold is that these things only happen because of uniquely evil people.
They happen because ordinary people, ourselves included, adapt very quickly to distorted systemic incentives, and we surrender our individual conscience to the perceived safety and security of the group.
And that leaves us with the truly defining question that history asks of every generation that goes through one of these moments.
It never asks, were you a good person?
It asks, what did we collectively tolerate and participate in when fear told us it was absolutely necessary? That's the provocative question we want to leave you with today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or a new topic that you would like covered in a future video.